Well, hello, and welcome back to the Participant YouTube channel. I'm joined yet again by my colleague Markus and Jack, and today we're going to take, I think, a slightly different path for this channel. We have often looked at early Christian texts, at Marcion's text, at the Apostolic Fathers and the Gospels, but in the last couple of videos, as we've discussed our books and the authors that have inspired us, one of the common themes that I have mentioned quite a lot is the necessity to be aware of surroundings, the backgrounds, the backdrop, the milieu, if you will, of the text we are studying. And so, with that in mind, we're going to approach one of the bigger subjects of the time, and one that undoubtedly shaped not just the Middle East, but also the entirety, I'd argue, of Judaism and Christianity, even up to now, where it is particularly relevant. And so that theme is the Bar Kokhba Revolt, something that I actually only really came across in my master's. It was very much skirted around in my BA for one reason or another. But during my MA, it became apparent to me that this was a really, really important subject. So, Markus, why don't you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about the Bar Kokhba Revolt, where it came from, who the main players were.
Yeah, before we start talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt itself, I mean, just to give the dates, we reckon that it took place between the years 132 and 135. So we are in the midst of the Emperor Hadrian, or rather not the midst, but rather towards the end of his reign. But why I'm saying before we can dig into what the revolt itself meant and how it ended, we have to admit that it is still under research today. I mean, we have Peter Schäfer and a number of other scholars who have looked into the Bar Kokhba revolt. However, the problem is that we are missing a Josephus Flavius. We don't have the person who would describe the revolt against the Romans, of the Jews against the Romans, in detail, as we have it for the first Jewish revolt and the first Jewish war in the years 66 and following. And for that very reason, I think, New Testament scholarship has so far focused not exclusively, but primarily on the first Jewish war. And here comes the first abnormality, I think, that we face when we look into and compare the two revolts. The first revolt, of course, ends in a disaster for the Jews, as does the second. In the meantime, we even have an intermediate revolt in Alexandria in the years 117. But usually we speak of the first Jewish war and the second Jewish war, or the first Jewish revolt and the second Jewish revolt, those two revolts in the first, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. These two revolts were major wars, and that's why we only talk about those two usually. The second one that concerns us today is, and that's one of the reasons, is because it is less known, no detailed description. However, we know quite a lot, and maybe even a bit more in one sense, that we have found in the 1960s original letters that were circulating either as copies or as originals, that we don't know, but they're dated to the times of the Second Jewish War, of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And these are letters written by the leader of that revolt, and it's called Bar Kokhba revolt because the main protagonist, the leader of the Jewish part in that revolt, was called Simon ben Kokhba, or Bar Kokhba, who then a few years later became the nickname of Bar Kokhba And Bar Kokhba then reminded, and was almost like a title given to him, reminded of as a Messiah figure, because it was said it is the son of the star. Now, the son of the star reminds of Numeri, because in Numeri we are told that there will be a star or a son of a star who will rescue Jerusalem. So let's start with that kind of an intro. So two very similar in the outcomes, very similar, disastrous for the Jews, but different, and a big question for us as scholars of texts of the 2nd and 1st centuries is, do our canonical texts or non-canonical texts, do these texts refer, when they speak about, for example, the destruction of the temple, do they refer to rather the first Jewish war or to the second Jewish war? Now, when you take New Testament scholarship of today, I guess and would bet on it that over 95 to 98%, probably 99% of all New Testament scholars are relating anything that's being said in, let's say, the canonical writings is about the first Jewish war. I have in the book that I wrote about Marcion and the dating of the Synoptic Gospels attempted to make a case to revise that linking of the canonical texts to the first Jewish war. And why did I do that? First of all, because even quite conservative colleagues who have looked into the description, let's say, of Matthew, Mark, or Luke in the eschatological scenarios, in which way they relate to what, for example, Josephus Flavius is giving us as a description of what happened in the Second Jewish War, particularly with regards to the temple, they were doubting that both descriptions match. One of the major differences, for example, is that we read in Matthew that something was standing, kathestika, he says, so it's a perfect verb form, that something was standing on the temple place, which is a denugma, which is an offense. Now, from Josephus, we know after the year 70 or 68, the temple was flattened down. I mean, it was completely erased. It was burned to ground. Nothing stood there. So where would the delugma come from? When I published that, my own supervisor, Adolf Martin Ritter, objected to me, but conceded that after 68, nothing stood at the temple place. So he referred this kind of a delugma back to Caracalla and was saying, well, we have this legend that Caracalla wanted to put a statue on the mountain, and that might be a reference back to then. But that is 20 years earlier than the First Jewish War. Hence, he discredited also, like me, the link between the eschatological scenario in the canonical Gospels with the First Jewish War. Just explaining what stood there in a different way. If you look at it, I think it is mere reminiscence. I mean, how and why would people who talk about the destruction of Jerusalem refer not to what happened in Jerusalem at the time of the destruction? So I think it was a non-starter as an explanation. In contrast, we know from the Second Jewish War that Hadrian built the statue of Zeus on the mountain. And that's quite clearly a delugma. I mean, this is an offense to the Jews. Not only that, the Second Jewish War, as we know from sources, had not only resulted in the disastrous defeat of the Jews, for the first time in history, or no, not in history, sorry, the first time in the Second Temple times, were banned from not only the temple that was destroyed, but also from the city. And this kind of a ban of every circumcised Jew, including the women, lasted for centuries. So when we now compare the outcome, it's not just a defeat for the Jews. It was a massively different defeat for the Jews. They were expelled from their own place. When we take the other side, the Roman side, the two wars are incomparable too. People who are or have been, like Jack just a few days ago, to Rome, they will remember the big column of Titus. And on this column, we have a description, or rather a depiction, of the end of the Jewish war, because it was fought by Titus. And here we have on the column the parade and the triumph, where the Romans, proud as they are about the destruction of Jerusalem, particularly of the temple circuit, parade the trophies, the prisoners, the slaves, all Jews, but also what they have gathered from the temple site itself, the gold, the treasures, and the religious elements. Very famous, of course, is the seven arms lightning. So we have a great procession that the Romans celebrated, and then showed, of course, that with the money they recovered from the Temple of Jerusalem, and after that, of course, the transfer of the Jerusalem tax of the temple, which was given every year by Jewish families to the temple for the running of the temple, that was diverted to a specifically newly created cash box within the treasury of the Romans. So all that is being displayed, and it shows the Romans were the big winners. Mm-hmm. It could be a bigger contrast at the end of the Second Jewish War. Here, Hadrian, who had started to fight the Jews who rebelled, probably, but we're not exactly sure to what extent the temple itself and the idea of rebuilding the temple by the Jews led to the rebellion itself against Hadrian and the Romans. Hadrian might have caused other disruptions why the Jews started to revolt against him. For example, we know Hadrian was against circumcision. He thought, not because he didn't want the Jews to do circumcision, but he thought that this is an infliction of human bodies, which he thought no religion should allow. But however it was, the end of the war was a disaster not only for the Jews, but also for the Romans. The entire army that Hadrian had at his disposal in Palestine, and even including the Syriac troops from the north, were decimated by the Jewish rebels under Bar Kokhba. He was apparently a very gifted leader, not supported by all Jews, including some, if not most, of the Christians. However, the war ended with a massive disaster for the Romans. Even in later times, people who remembered this war were stating that it was the biggest defeat of the Romans ever. And Suetonius gives us the report that Hadrian, after the war, which he only won because Spanish Navy troops helped out and defeated the Palestinians. Palestinian Jews, that Hadrian addresses the Senate after the war in silence. So instead of stating, yes, the emperor and the troops are okay, which was the normal way to address the Senate after a war, to show the war has been won, he kept his silence. And Suetonius and later authors read this silence as the first emperor and the first defeat, not just of an emperor, but the first defeat of Rome in history of Rome. So we can imagine now, if we compare the two scenarios, also with the drastic result that Hadrian bans the Jews from Jerusalem, my suggestion was that it looks rather that an enormous production of Christian and Jewish writings that were produced and which we can hardly date seems rather related to the bigger disaster for both sides, which is the Second Jewish War, than the First Jewish War. And I think it is more the reception of the text by Josephus and the impact it had, particularly amongst the Christians, that Christians related what they wrote. That people who read the texts that Christian wrote related rather to the First than to the Second Jewish War.
Yeah. And I just want to hammer home some of that a little bit, because the disastrous nature for both sides really can't be understated. I mean, when the Romans, first started this business, they thought that they might be able to put it down with some ease, but they ended up with 12 legions going there to defeat this. And to put that into context, Caesar essentially took all of Gaul with 4, and then the support a little later of 10 more, right? So the entirety of these Gallic barbarians versus this small Jewish state, one would think that would be no problem. And that, I think, attests partly to two things: how difficult it was, both, as you mentioned, the inspirational but also the tactical military mind of Bar Kokhba, who won several great victories, particularly when only 2 legions were present at the time, and also the amount of numbers he had. I know that there is some dispute around whether there's exaggeration of numbers, and particularly, as we'll come on to in a minute, the aftermath of how many died. But there's no doubt that many rallied to his cause and saw this as a freedom and liberation movement, something of, well, as he is recognized as a messiah to liberate them, and to take inspiration from, for example, the Maccabees and such in that like. And you can only imagine how strong a feeling there must have been about this, particularly after the First Jewish War. I think to the Germany after the First World War, that there becomes bitterness and resentment because the punishment afterwards is too harsh. And so too after the first, there's clearly resentment still remaining. And you mentioned briefly as well the Kitos in the middle of these two wars. But even so, massive. And then on the side of the Jews, I mean, whether this number is exaggerated or not, even if it's close to this, that 500,000 are dead. In an ancient world, even now, I mean, that's an absolutely colossal figure. But in the ancient world, that is a cataclysmic figure, particularly in somewhere such as Jerusalem. And then even if you are not one of the dead, of which you might be lucky to be, you're either expelled or given serious punitive measures. You lose everything, land, maybe your freedom, you're taken into slavery, etc. And this, in normal times, I suppose, as you mentioned, Marcus, would have been a great victory. And you often, and I noticed this when I was in Rome, saw all the great arches of victory, including of Trajan and others. And yet, on this occasion, as you mentioned, there is no victory arch built like there was after the First Jewish War. Because this is not a proud moment. This is not something that we want to recognize as Roman. And I think it's interesting because in Hadrian's career, we don't really remember that as much as we should. He's often known as quite a good emperor, does quite well. He's looked at with Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius as quite a good one. But actually, this is a really detrimental thing. So moving back to Jerusalem then, Marcus, you've mentioned briefly some of the relationship that Christians might have had with this as it was happening, and they're working out with it in their texts. But one of the things that I want to press you on a little bit further is something that I know you've written about in the past, and that is the leadership of Christian communities in Jerusalem at the time. Naturally, many of the Sanhedrin are killed after the war, but in terms of Christian leadership, what do we know about how Christians were being run? I'm sure many of our listeners, although we don't have much information about this, would like to know more about sort of that crossover point from where Judaism and Christianity sort of begin to coalesce more around Christianity. Someone mentioned in the comments a minute ago the Peter-Paul dispute about circumcision. Now all the Jews are gone. Who's really taking control in Jerusalem of Christianity?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and a very important question. I've written a bit about it, but it is, I think, a crucial point, and probably the most crucial point in Jewish-Christian relations. This war, who took part in the war, which side she or he stood, and the outcome of the war. First of all, Eusebius gives us as a reference to the war the information that because of the ban of all circumcised Jews from Jerusalem, also all circumcised Christians had to leave. So it was not just a ban of Jews, it was a ban of Jews and Jews who had sided with the Christian communities. And that leads, as he says, to the very first uncircumcised bishop elected for and in Jerusalem. That tells us two important informations. Up to the Second Jewish War, Christians in Jerusalem, and by saying that, the majority of Christians were circumcised, were reckoned by the authorities to be Jews. And probably when you had asked them whether they are Jews, they would have said, yes, we're Jews. Up to that point, indeed, we don't have any mention of the term Christianity in Christian literature. So the first time that term appears is in the post-Bar Kokhba times. Hence, it supports the fact that Christians up to the end of the Second Jewish War were firmly embedded in the Jewish community. And when Justin Martyr refers to the Bar Kokhba War, he mentions that the leader, Bar Kokhba, treated the Christians, as he says, in an utter horrible way, by which people usually understand Bar Kokhba killed those Christians. Now, why would he have killed Christians instead of Romans? Christians certainly did not fight him. But I think the supposed element to that is he was persecuting those Christians because, A, they did not side with him. Maybe they were collaborating with the Romans. But the second assumption, which is the implication of it, is that Bar Kokhba even reckoned that Christians, being Jews, should have supported his revolt. And hence the harsh treatment of these people who didn't support the right side, but in the eyes of Bar Kokhba at least, stood on the wrong side of the fence. Now, this reading is not too wrong. We can see from the flip side. If Christians were allowed to stay after the Second Jewish War, as long as they were not circumcised, and were able to re-elect leadership in Jerusalem to their flock, that would have meant that Romans perceived these uncircumcised people no longer as Jews. And it's no surprise that in those apologists that we have, who for the first time start writing under the empire, the late empire of Hadrian and of his successor Antoninus Pius, that these people are the very first to differentiate between themselves and the Jews. So while, let's say, in the letter of Pliny, in the beginning of the 2nd century, maybe some indications even before, if Nero's persecution was a real persecution, where Christians by the mob were singled out from Jews, if all that were true, then we have an external view that people were reckoned to be no longer fully Jewish, but were still part of the Jewish tradition. And that changes. That changes drastically after the end of the Second Jewish War, where people like Aristides and others come out and state that they are no longer Jews. They don't want to be any longer Jews. Or where people like Justin Martyr come out in a different way and say, you Jews are no longer Jews, but we are the true ones. Verus Israel. We are the true Israel. You are not. So we have this type of a divide between, let's say, different Jewish traditions in the past. And if we look into how diverse Jewish practices were in a city like Rome or in a city like Jerusalem, we can imagine that every second synagogue was a different type of Jewish practice. So to have another one where a Jewish reading a la Jesus or a la Hillel or a la Shammai or a la who knows, that was nothing to be surprised about.
And if I might just jump in there, that you're directly relating to a super chat we got from Michael E. Thank you, Michael. Big fan of you, and thank you for your support. What types of Christian communities were in Judea at the time of the Bar Kokhba, and were they persecuted, as some church fathers said? I think you're sort of moving around this subject at the moment, so I thought I'd just bring it in here. To just give it the time of day.
Well, the problem with the persecutions of Christians is a big one. There are two, let's say, maximalist and minimalist views. There's the very minimalist view of our colleague in Birmingham. She thinks that persecutions almost did not exist at all. And then we have the maximalists, almost present in all our church histories, which sometimes state that Christians were persecuted all the time, be it by Romans or be it by Jews. I think neither nor. I keep with Jan Bremer, a good colleague and friend of mine, who says the more Protestant and the more enlightened scholars are, the fewer the numbers of martyrs are. And he believes that there were persecutions, there were martyrs, but maybe the number is not as big as we have them in our school books. Not because I'm Protestant, not because I'm an enlightened scholar, but I believe that even Jan overstates sometimes a bit the case by reading a number of these martyr stories, which we have from the late 2nd century, into 3rd, 4th, and so forth, right? And the question always is, to what extent are these martyr stories based on historical writings, on reports, on records of judges, and so forth? We don't know. So what we can say, however, is that if all our sources are not misleading us, then Nero indeed had persecuted or at least killed some of the Christians, although the reports that he gives and that are given about it are pretty strange. I mean, would you, for example, or would I start a major party to which I invite all the people to join me and set fire to people as candles? I mean, you cannot imagine the smell. I mean, that would be so appalling that I cannot imagine that anybody thinks of that stupidity. I think that is rhetoric and not reality. The reality behind might be that indeed, as we are told, Nero takes a group of people who were either not liked or who were singled out and makes them a scapegoat. So to divert his own failure or even implication in the fire of Rome and shifts it to a particular group, so the foreigners of today. The next persecution that we know, or that we are told to know, around the end of the 1st century, I think, is a chimera. Because we have different reports, and when you compare the pagan reports with Eusebius, for example, only Eusebius relates it to Christians, whereas the draconic measurements, for example, against one of the senators, was from somebody who had practiced Jewish practice, as the text says. Eusebius reads that as he has practiced Christian practice. And so he turns that into a persecution of Christians. That's then being used quite often to date Clement, because Clement talks about the harsh measurements and even the martyrdoms. He speaks about Peter and Paul. And then people think that he speaks about the persecution at the end of the 1st century, and then comes the full circle around. Hence, we have to date First Clement in the early years or late years of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. But again, I think that is, when I read scholarship today, that is by most people who have really looked into the facts, disputed. So I think that's been, of course, that's still being held by some colleagues, but not by those colleagues who have insider news and who have concerned themselves with the matter. So when come the next persecution? Well, the only we know is Nero, a small one, a local one, if at all, in Rome. The next one we know of is, again, a bit like in Rome. It is more neighbor's business than anything else. It is in the Pliny Trajan letter exchange, which comes from the beginning of 110 around in the 2nd century. And here we see that Trajan, if this letter exchange is genuine, maybe it's reworked, at least we know that Trajan, the emperor, is horribly against persecuting people. He wants his procurator to calm the situation down. Yes, to punish a few people if they are adamant, but his policy is concordia, so harmony, but not battle, not insider battle, not battle because of some religions where he didn't understand the difference between A and B. And certainly not a systematic looking into people to persecute them. That's why I wouldn't call it persecution. Maybe one or the other local, but certainly not a policy of Rome. The only policy of Rome was, of course, if you started a revolt, an upheaval against Rome, that was a war to be fought.
Yeah, and I'm largely with you. I think that there's again, the truth is often found somewhere in the middle of two extremes. And I think we often find there is the very conservative movement who have big numbers. But I also think that, and I find this not just in this subject, but also, for example, with the mythicism argument or with others, there's a baby in the bathwater situation where they become so extreme that you think, well, actually, they begin to just dismiss evidence as and when it comes to suit their hypothesis rather than at least saying, well, smoke and fire, etc. And I think that there were certainly persecutions, but again, I think it's always been the case, and this is a good lesson for us really back into history, as you mentioned with the persecutions of Nero and the disgust there would have been if we were all just lighting people on fire down the streets and walking down. People of that age, although they have different morals in some sense and different backgrounds, they are still fundamentally people. And one of the things that still remains true about people today, particularly minorities or people who are I don't know, of a certain disposition, I suppose, desire to see themselves as martyrs. They like the victimness. They think that it gives them some form of separation from people, and they think that it shows that they're going down the right path. And indeed, we get that great phrase in John and also in Ignatius of Antioch. The world will hate you, and that's what makes you great. And so this constant bombardment of Christian literature, that they were hated and killed and everyone was against them, the world, and at that point the Romans were the world, essentially, for all intents and purposes. Yeah, okay, now they're really great. And so clearly they're exaggerating. But on the flip side, there probably was something to be said.
It is interesting that, if I may come in, it's interesting that martyrdom was not a big for a number of Christians. So second century writings like the Epistle to Diogenes and others, they rather side with the idea to be a good part of the Roman Empire. In Aristides, in the Apology, you see he differentiates Christians from all sorts of cultures and religions of his time. The only one he doesn't dissociate himself from are from the Romans. So they rather saw themselves as part of the Roman Empire and part of Roman tradition. The second thing is, there is one group that was proud of having martyrs and who are therefore disputed by people like Justin or by Clement. And they say the people who claim to have most martyrs amongst their flock are the Marcionites. Now, this makes one again think, and it comes back to the question of where to date and where to place the synoptic gospels or the canonical gospels vis-a-vis the Gospel of Marcion. Why? If Marcion's flock was known for the broadest and probably most of the martyrs, I think that has to do with the eschatological expectation of Marcion. He believed that the end of time has to come pretty soon. Hence, there's no need to marry. There's no need, if you're married, to have sexual intercourse, because there's no need to have procreation. The times are finished. Like Paul says in his letter, 1 Thessalonians, time, even when we are alive, the time will stop. And if time stops anyway, then you can act and become a martyr, because then you're not cutting short much. And the second element to that is that you can have a pacifist position where you believe that if one wants to kill you, you better let yourself kill than to kill and defend yourself. And this is so much part of that gospel that Marcion brought forward. I mean, the core of this text, which we know as the mountain on the plain or the mountain on the sermon, is exactly that. People have persecuted the prophets and they are persecuting you now. And you should reckon with that. You should be poor. You should be modest. Anything where you want to make claims is nothing that you should think about. Nothing to inherit. Give it away. If somebody asks you for a shirt, give them twice. But that is making sense only if the end of times is imminent. Now, most of the authors, and you can see it already in the synoptical gospels, let alone then in John and in other writings, like take Acts or the pastoral letters, yeah, it is an extension of time. You can see it in 2 Thessalonians. So it is a moving away of this imminency. It's a prolongation of time. And in these times, when time is not up, but time is to come, of course you have to have kids. And of course you have to think about the future of the community. You have to have jobs, you have to have a hierarchy, you have to have posts, you have to have all kinds of regulations. And this is what we get. And this is the other reason why I believe that these canonical texts, as we have them, and even the canonical version of Paul as we have him, is late 2nd century. It starts with reversions and revisions in the mid-2nd century, but it develops further and it becomes an established church, which doesn't want to move away, not in the next 5 years, let alone in the next 500 years. And I would say, as Rome behaves today, it won't move away for the next 5,000 years, as long as human beings exist. But the parousia, the coming back of Christ, God knows if he came back while we have this session here, nobody would believe him, like Dostoevsky's great inquisitor.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was referring particularly to when the martyrologies are written of these figures like Polycarp, Ignatius, or Clement. They always seem to have a great desire for martyrdom, right? They try and show that that's present, and I think that is because they want to be the victims rising from the fire out again, and like Jesus, and they're hated, etc. But no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that when you then begin to understand Pauline literature and its development from pre-canonical to canonical in that lens, you then... One of the things I find so funny is that so many of the questions that I see colleagues ask are questions that are only necessary when one has the current scholarly consensus.
Yeah.
They'd rather have the consensus view with problems than our view. Now, don't get me wrong, we have issues that we need to sort out too, but our view that dismantles their problems. And I think that's quite funny. Just one more thing I want to touch on, and this a bit goes back to Michael E.'s question, and that is namely the leadership of the church in Jerusalem. One of the things I find really interesting is, and again, I think more needs to be written on this, is the development of the hierarchy and those in leadership in the churches as time progresses. And I think particularly of the Bar Kokhba because it marks a transition from Judas of Jerusalem, well, this is according to Epiphanius and Eusebius, who was the last Jewish bishop in Jerusalem. Some even claim a relation of James, and the taking over of Marcus, your namesake, as the first non-Jewish bishop. Now, we could maybe discuss the can't get my words out today. We can discuss the veracity of these stories and whether they or not they are true. But there's no doubt that what would have had to happen, a bit like perhaps in Rome when the Jews were expelled, there is a movement from Jewish leaders who are no longer allowed to be there to some form of non-Jewish Christian leaders. And so what do you think what do you think the impact of that was in Jerusalem, going for maybe decades with a fairly Jewish community of Christians to now, perhaps, at least according to Epiphanius and Eusebius, a non-Jewish leadership model?
Yeah, you mentioned it by the names themselves. Judas, of course, is a Jewish name. Marcus is not a Greek name; it's a Roman name. Yeah, it's also used amongst the Greeks, but it's more a Roman name. Yeah, so it's not Marcos but Marcus. And this is one of the first impacts. It is not just a moving of a Jewish group away from Judaism. Even the Marcionite Christians are not non-Jews. I've tried to show that in the past because that's quite often mistakenly said. It is a different form of Jews. We have, from hundreds of years, I mean, since Alexander the Great, we have Greek-speaking Jews, if not older times. Yeah, we have all sorts of language and cultural related Jews, and we have Roman Jews. We have them in the inscriptions everywhere. So it's not a move away from being Jewish, but it's a move away from subscribing to a type of Jewishness that becomes concentrated in the Aramaic and then in the rabbinic tradition. And I think that's one of the anachronistic mistakes we make today when we talk about these times and talk about the Jewish-Christian relations. It is, I think, an obfuscation, because we better would say, as Guy Strumse and a number of others are trying at least, yeah, that this is a move from different Jewish ranks and traditions into a concentration of a Roman type and Greek and Greco-Roman type of Jewishness, which is then being continued, which step by step becomes identified and self-identifies with being Christian as a form of Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Syriac, and so forth, form of a self-standing religion later. But far from it, far from the 3rd century, far in the 4th century, and even later, many, many Christians still identify and practice Jewish practices. And the biggest debate we have at the end of the 2nd century is not whether we believe in 1 or 3 gods, not whether Christ is divine or human or a spirit or wisdom. Nothing of that. The dispute is, and that breaks almost the entire church in 2 parts, if not in more parts, as we now know, is the question, do we end our fasting on the day before Sabbath or the day after, or on Sabbath? It is a Jewish ritual question between Jews who want to keep what the Jews do, fasting. But they want to do it in different forms, at different days. It's not the foundation, what later becomes the difference between Christianity and Judaism. No, it is within the Jewish tradition that the battle is fought, amongst Jews and others who also practice Jewish rites and rituals. So the anachronism we have is that we, for 1,000 years and maybe 1,600 years, we identify one group as Christians and the others as Jews, not seeing that certainly for the first 200 years, but I would even think for some time later, these groups are anything but far away from each other and are not groups. I mean, they're probably strands, overlapping strands, as we can see when we read, for example, John Chrysostom, and that's late 4th century. So when it comes to leadership, back again, yeah. So we have a leadership that transforms itself more into a Roman and Greek sort of leadership amongst a Greek and Roman type of Jewishness. And that identifies itself more and more. And it's interesting to see that the other strand, which identifies themselves more with Yavne and with the early rabbinic tradition, with big rabbinic leaders then, they're not writing Greek, they're not writing Latin, although they know Latin, as we know from Jewish writings in Rome. They know Greek, which we also know, but the liturgical and the legal documents to which they refer, which becomes like the New Covenant writings, is in Aramaic. And the liturgy is in Hebrew. And so we have two, let's say, ritual traditions, which, like later the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim, it is liturgical and ritual diversity that grows more and more and sets itself more and more apart, including leadership. Now, Christian leadership, of course, is a big mess in the 2nd century because titles are not clear. People call themselves presbyters. The same people are called by others bishops. The same people in Irenaeus, for example. So we are at the end of the 2nd century. He talks about presbyters. He talks about bishops. He doesn't know the difference. And so it is slowly establishing a form of leadership. Likewise, rabbis. I mean, we have rabbis being mentioned in our canonical writings, yeah? But what do we know about them? I mean, to what extent are these the same rabbis as later? How does the Pharisees relate to what later is the leadership of the Jewish communities amongst the rabbis? People can't make it out. It seems that the Pharisaic tradition becomes more and more picked up by the rabbis we know from the Tanaitics and the Amoritics and so forth. So from 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, then Jewish leadership. But the link back to the traditions earlier is very difficult because we know Pharisees are, presumably at least, the minority in the 1st and even in the 2nd century amongst the Jewish groups. And Sadducees are more important, at least with regards the high priesthood. So the temple-related people. But we know too little about this transition into the Jewish leaderships as we know in Christian leadership. When we look at Melito, for example, was he bishop? Maybe. What was that? When he travels to Israel to make sure he knows the right books, he's not interested in New Testament books. The sole list that he brings back is a list of Jewish books. So to him, the reference is still the Jewish book of the Bible. And so it is for most people in the 2nd century.
Yeah, I think that question around leadership and what these words mean, bishop, priest, deacon, I just, there's such a complex mess there, right? And ultimately, until one orders the texts chronologically, I don't think an answer is very easy to find.
It is I totally agree. And the very few texts that we can date, like the works of Justin, which are dated in the late 150s and 160s. Here, when we come to the term of deacon, for example, he says the so-called deacons.
Indeed, it's like a neologism. It's like a brand new word to him.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned in Irenaeus, Polycarp is bishop, priest. I mean, both.
In First Clement, the titles he has throughout First Clement, and it's a long letter. It's the elders, presbyters. And there is one passage in 1 Clement, if I remember rightly, 42 or 44, where he talks about bishops and deacons. Mm-hmm. And then he says, this is nothing new because it's already written in the writings of the scriptures.
And goes back to the Jews.
Exactly. He goes back to the prophets.
Yeah.
So no New Testament writing is his reference, not Philippians 1:1, where the only passage where Paul, the canonical Paul, talks about bishops and deacons. No, he doesn't know about it, I think. First Clement goes back to the prophets, which shows the claim that he makes that these are not new types, which he only mentions once, are new types.
And perhaps also obviously 1 Timothy in that as well, right?
Precisely.
He clearly does not have access to this material, and he clearly does know Paul. So how is it that he knows? And again, this happens with so many of the apostolic fathers, as they're known, that they all know Paul and don't know what the hell he says about anything.
At least not what the canonical Paul says, or
Well,
in many ways. I mean, they know a form of Paul which is no longer Marcion's, but they are not having access to the pastoral letters, not to Hebrews, and not to specific passages that we today have in Paul.
Yeah, and it's not just limited to the threefold ecclesial hierarchy either. It's soteriology, it's the Parousia. It's literally so many subjects that they seem incapable
Absolutely.
of knowing what Paul said. And I think that again, it comes back to the overarching theme that we always seem to repeat on this podcast, that, and why is it that we still wrestle with questions that have an obvious answer, i.e. reorder the text that we have in terms of its date, and wrestle with the problems that we do need to, which we currently are doing as a team, which there are plenty. It seems like a waste of scholarship. But anyway.
But I think the Bar Kokhba War and the First Jewish War, and the difference between the two is one of a key element in the discussion that we have.
Yes, and its cataclysmic nature, undoubtedly. And so I highly recommend, maybe we'll come back to this in a future episode. We might talk about more some of the military history behind it, because I've been reading about that recently. I think that'd be really interesting as well, and not just the relationship it has with Christianity, but
let me point to one publication which I did together with Eve-Marie Becker in Studia Patristica, volume 19:9, which is an article that are published on Marcion and the dating of Mark and the Synoptic Gospels, because I looked with her into this eschatological passage that we are discussing today. And this text you will find on my academia.edu entry for free, so you can download it, and many more arguments that we discussed today. I discussed with Eve-Marie Becker, who, of course, is a staunch defender of the First Jewish War being the Cataclysmic revolt and not the second one. So here you've got the nice discussion between the New Testament scholar and me as a patristic scholar.
That's great. I'll link that in the chat and in the description below in just a moment for your delectation. So, as always, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure the Bar Kokhba will be a theme to which we return in the future due to its importance. As always, please remember to subscribe and hit like, and also support Mark and I on Patreon. Give Marcus a follow on academia.edu. It's one of the greatest treasure troves of articles by him, and they're all free, which is amazing in this day and age of academia, where apparently everything seems to cost £150 per book. Goodbye, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.